The Dowager Duchess of Ellesmere set down her wineglass with the small, final click of a woman closing a ledger, and she said it loudly enough for the whole table to hear. "She's no one. A companion. Lady Wexcombe's paid girl. You needn't trouble yourself, Gabriel." 22 candles burned down the length of the great table at Ellesmere Park, and not one of them moved, because the air in the dining room had gone perfectly still. Frances Aldous sat where she had been put, below the silver epergne, below the salt, between an empty chair and the deaf rector of the parish, in the grey gown she owned because it was the gown a companion was permitted to own. She had spent the whole of dinner being a piece of the furniture, and she had been good at it. She had learned to be good at it. Now 30 faces had turned toward her, and she understood, with the cold clarity of someone who has been laughed at before, that the Duchess had named her aloud, the way one names a stain on the cloth. She kept her hands in her lap. She kept her eyes on the candle in front of her, on the bead of wax sliding down its side and hardening before it reached the silver. She had a great deal of practice at being looked at and giving nothing back. At the head of the table, the Duke of Ellesmere pushed back his chair. It scraped on the floor, a long, unhurried sound that everyone heard. He rose to his full height, and he was a big man, broad through the shoulders in a way no tailor could disguise, and none had tried, and the candlelight ran gold along the line of his jaw as he came up out of his seat. He did not look at his mother. He looked down the whole length of the table, past the epergne, past the salt, to the grey gown and the still hands, and the face that had given nothing back. And he walked. Footmen pressed themselves to the walls. The rector's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Somewhere, a woman in primrose silk made a sound that was meant to be a laugh, and died before it became one. The Duke walked the length of his own dining room, and he stopped at Frances Aldous' chair, and he held out his arm. "Miss Aldous," he said, "you will allow me." It was not a question. His voice was low and even, and it carried to every corner of the room precisely because he had not raised it. His right arm was crooked toward her, the dark blue of his coat sleeve catching the light, the broad hand open and waiting. Frances looked at the arm. She looked at it for one heartbeat longer than was wise, because there was something in the way he held it, slightly stiff, the elbow not quite square, as though the joint had once been taught a lesson it had never entirely forgotten, that pawed at the back of her mind, like a name she could not place. Then she set her hand on his sleeve, because 30 people were watching and there was nothing else in the world to do, and she rose, and the whole table held its breath. "Mother," said the Duke without turning his head, "Miss Aldous will sit by me. See that her place is laid." 6 months before any of that, on a road in Berkshire that the spring rains had turned to a brown river, a curricle had gone over at a flooded ford and pinned a man underneath it, with his right arm bent the wrong way against a stone. Gabriel Severn remembered very little of it cleanly. He remembered the horse screaming and the cold black water climbing his coat, and the white shock of the bone when he tried to move and could not. He remembered thinking, with a strange detachment, that this was an absurd way for the 8th Duke of Ellesmere to die. Scarcely a year and a half a duke, having buried his brother and inherited the title he had never wanted, drowning in a foot of muddy water on the Reading Road, because his groom had said the ford was passable, and it was not. And then there had been a woman. He remembered her hands first. They came out of the rain and the dark, and they were not gentle. They were fast and certain, and they did not waste a movement. She had got the curricle off him somehow, with a fallen branch and a tenant's boy she had shouted out of a nearby cottage, and she had dragged him up the bank by his good arm, while he cursed and the world swung sickeningly around him. She had looked at the broken arm for the space of one breath, and she had said, in a low, clear voice that did not tremble, "This will hurt. I am sorry. Hold your breath." Then she had set it. He had screamed. He was not ashamed to remember that he had screamed, because she had pulled the bone back into its place with a wrench that whited out the whole night. And then the pain had dropped, all at once, from unbearable to merely terrible, and he had understood that she knew exactly what she was doing. They had carried him to the coaching inn at the crossroads. There had been no surgeon within 15 miles, and the roads were under water, and so the woman had stayed. He remembered her by the fire, opening a slim brass case of instruments, a physician's case, worn smooth at the corners, and splinting his arm between 2 lengths of kindling and a torn petticoat, with a competence that no lady of his acquaintance possessed. He remembered the fever coming up in the small hours, and her cool hand on his forehead, and her voice telling him to drink something bitter. He remembered asking her name twice, and both times she had only said, "Drink." And then it had been dawn, grey and wet through the inn window, and his groom had been pounding up the stairs with a surgeon from Reading, and in the noise and the bustle of it, the woman had simply not been there. Gone. No name, no direction. The innkeeper said she had walked out at first light to catch the northbound post, and that she had paid for her own room rather than let it be put to the gentleman's account, which the innkeeper had thought a very odd thing for a woman in a grey travelling gown to do. The arm had healed. The Reading surgeon had said it was the cleanest setting of a compound break he had seen outside a London hospital, and that the gentleman owed his arm, and very likely the use of it, to whoever had done it before he arrived. For 6 months, Gabriel had looked for her. He had written to the inn. He had written to the northbound coaching company. He had described her to anyone who might know. Not tall, brown hair coming loose from its pins, a steady voice, a brass instrument case, hands that did not waste a movement, and got nothing, because a woman travelling alone to a new situation leaves no trail a duke can follow, and the world is full of grey gowns. He had very nearly stopped looking. And then his mother had filled the house with guests for the autumn shooting, and on the second evening he had come down late to dinner, and he had heard a low, clear voice 3 places down the table say to the deaf rector, "No, sir, the seed, not the leaf. The leaf will do you no good at all." And he had looked up, and the whole bottom of his stomach had dropped away, because he knew that voice. He had been listening for that voice for 6 months. He had spent the rest of dinner with his heart going like a hammer, telling himself he was a fool, that it could not be, that he had built her up in his memory until any plain brown-haired woman with quick hands could wear her face. And then his mother had called her no one down the length of the table, the way one names a stain on the cloth. And Gabriel 7, who had learned in 2 years of grief to keep his face very still, had pushed back his chair. The room they had given Francis was at the cold end of the east wing, 3 flights up, where the companions and the upper servants slept, and it had a narrow bed and a washstand and a window that looked out on the stable yard. She had been glad of it. A room of one's own, even a cold one, was not a thing she had been able to count on since her father died. She was still standing in the middle of it at midnight, in her shift, with her hair down, holding the brass instrument case against her chest like a shield, when Lady Wexcombe came in without knocking. "Well," said Lady Wexcombe, shutting the door behind her. She was 71, small and upright as a poker, and she had buried 2 husbands and a great deal of her fortune, and retained both her diamonds and her sense of mischief. She lowered herself into the room's single chair with the care of a woman whose knees were her enemies. "I have not enjoyed a dinner so much in 20 years. Did you see Drusilla Carra's face? She looked as though she had bitten a wasp." "My lady." Francis's voice came out steadier than she felt. "I did not. I never asked him to." "Of course you didn't." Lady Wexcombe waved a beringed hand. "That is rather the point of it, child. A man does not cross a room like that for a woman who asks." She tilted her head, and her sharp old eyes went over Francis slowly, and something in them sharpened further. "What I should like to know is why. The Duke of Ellesmere has not noticed a living soul in 2 years, not since his brother died and dropped the whole weight of this place on him. He sits at the head of his own table like a man at his own funeral, and tonight he walks the length of it for my paid companion." She let that sit. "You are a great many things, Francis Aldous, but you are not a fool. So I will ask you plainly. Do you know him?" Frances thought about it. She turned it over honestly in the candlelight. The broad shoulders, the gold along the jaw, the low, even voice, the arm held just slightly wrong. She had never in her life been in a room with the Duke of Ellesmere. She would have remembered. "No," she said. "I have never seen him before this evening. I would swear to it." Lady Wexcombe studied her a moment longer, and then she made a small sound that might have been disappointment, or might have been the opposite, and she heaved herself up out of the chair. "Then we are in for an interesting fortnight," she said. "Go to bed. And Frances." She paused at the door, and for once there was no mischief in it. "Whatever he wants, hold your price high. They will all assume the worst of you in any case. You may as well make them assume it of a woman with a spine." She went out. Frances stood a while longer with the brass case against her chest. Then she put it down on the washstand, where she could see it from the bed, the way her father had always set it on the shelf above his desk, so that it was the first thing he saw in the morning. And she blew out the candle, and she did not sleep. The Duke did not sleep either. He sat in the library after the guests had gone up, in the wing where the staff had learned to leave him alone, and he turned a glass of brandy between his hands without drinking it. The fire had burned low. Across the room, on the great desk that had been his brother Marcus's desk, and his father's before that, a stack of estate papers waited that he had not been able to make himself read for a week. The chair behind the desk was empty. It was always empty. He had never once sat in it. 2 years a duke, and he still chose, every evening, the worn leather chair by the fire that had been the younger son's chair. Because the desk was Marcus's, and to sit in it felt like theft. He flexed his right hand slowly, opening and closing the fingers, feeling the deep ache that came up in the joint whenever the weather turned wet. It would ache for the rest of his life, the surgeon had said. He had come to be glad of it. It was the only thing he had to remember her by. That and a brass case he had never seen again. And a voice. "This will hurt. I am sorry. Hold your breath." She had been 3 places down his own table tonight. She had sat there through the soup and the fish and his mother's contempt, and she had given nothing back. And the not giving back was the most familiar thing about her, because it was exactly what she had done on the Reading Road. Pulled a screaming stranger out of a flood, set his bones, sat up all night with his fever, and asked nothing, and left before she could be thanked. She did not know him. He had seen it in her face when he held out his arm. Bewilderment, wariness, the flat, careful blankness of a woman bracing for a cruelty. She had looked at the arm too long. He had seen that as well, a flicker, a half-recognition she could not place. But she did not know him. Of course she did not. She had seen a fevered man in the dark for 1 night. He had spent 6 months learning the shape of her hands by heart. He drank the brandy then, all of it, and he set the glass down, and he made himself a promise in the empty room. He would not frighten her. He would not crowd her. He would not let his mother turn her into a scandal to be swept out with the autumn leaves. He had lost a great many things in 2 years, and learned to bear the loss of them. He was not going to lose this one, twice. The Dowager Duchess sent for her son at 10 the next morning, in the small yellow sitting room she had made her own since she had ceased to be the mistress of Ellesmere and become its dowager, a fact she had never entirely forgiven the universe for arranging. "You made a spectacle of yourself," she said, before he had finished closing the door. She was at her writing desk with the morning's cards spread before her, and she did not look up. "And of me. I've had 4 notes already. Lady Brearley's was almost civil, which means she is delighted. By Thursday it will be in every drawing room from here to London that the Duke of Ellesmere is dangling after a companion." "Let it be," Gabriel said. "Let it." She set down her pen. She was a handsome woman still, fine-boned and straight-backed, with her son's grey eyes gone to flint, and when she was angry she became very quiet, which Gabriel had feared as a boy, and no longer did. "Do you know what that girl is? She's the daughter of a country physician who died owing money. She has no family that will receive her, no portion, no name worth the saying. She is in this house because Hester Wexcombe is too mean to pay a proper attendant, and too lame to manage without one. She empties chamber pots and reads aloud, and is grateful for it. That is the woman you walked the length of my dinner table for. My dinner table, Gabriel said mildly. I believe the table is mine, Mother, along with the house and the candles, and the chair you have put Miss Aldous below for a week. The colour went out of his mother's face and then came back. I am trying, she said, low, to protect you. You have a duty. There is a girl of birth and fortune under this very roof who would, Drusilla Carrow, who would make you an unexceptionable wife, and you know it, and you have known it since the spring, and instead, you choose to humiliate me in front of 30 people for the sake of a— Be careful, said Gabriel, what you call her. He said it gently. That was the thing his mother would think about afterward, lying awake, that he had not raised his voice, that he had never once in 2 years raised his voice to her, and that somehow that was worse than if he had. He crossed the room and stood looking out of the window at the gravel sweep where a footman was walking the Carrow carriage horses, and he was quiet for a moment. I owe her a debt, he said at last. That is all I will tell you. It is mine, and it is not small, and I mean to pay it. You will treat her as my guest while she is under my roof, or you will explain to me why my own mother cannot manage common courtesy to a woman who has done this family more good than the whole of Viscount Carrow's fortune ever will. He bowed to her, correctly, and he went out. And the Dowager Duchess sat for a long time looking at the cards on her desk without seeing them, because the word debt had frightened her in a way she could not name. Frances had hoped that the Duke, having made his point at dinner, would forget her. Great men did, in her experience. They performed a kindness for an audience, and then the audience went home, and the kindness went with it. He found her in the long library before noon. She had gone there to escape. Lady Wexcombe was napping. The other ladies were at their needlework in the saloon, where Frances was not wanted, and the library was the one room in the house where a companion might sit unremarked among the books. She had taken down a battered volume of Withering on the Foxglove, because it had been her father's chief subject, and she had not held it in 2 years, and she was reading it by the window, with her father's brass case open on the sill beside her. She liked to have it open. She liked to see the small bright tools laid in their velvet beds, when the door opened and the whole room changed its weather. Forgive me, the Duke said. I did not know the room was occupied. He had not, she thought, looked surprised to find her there. She rose anyway, the book held against her like a wall. Your Grace, I'll go. You will not. He came a few steps in. He was looking at the brass case on the windowsill, and something moved behind his face, some held-down thing she could not read. You are reading Withering. My father's book. She heard her own voice go careful and flat. He was a physician. I'll take it back to its shelf. Keep it. He stopped a polite distance off, his hands clasped behind him, and the formality of it was somehow more unsettling than if he had come close. Miss Aldous, I owe you an apology. Last night I put you in an impossible position for the sake of making a point to my mother, and you bore it with more grace than I had any right to ask. I am sorry for it. This was not what she had braced for. She had braced for charm, or for the slow circling that a certain kind of gentleman did around a woman with no protector. An apology was a door opening onto a room she did not know. You needn't apologize to me, Your Grace, she said. You may seat your guests wherever you please. It is no matter where I sit. It is a great matter where you sit, he said, and we both know it, so let us not pretend otherwise. There was the faintest dryness to it, the ghost of something almost like humor, and it startled her into actually looking at him for the first time. Grey eyes, steady, tired at the corners. A man who slept badly. I find I dislike pretending, I have done rather a lot of it lately, and it has not improved my temper."
"And what is it you are not pretending, Your Grace?"
The question came out sharper than she meant. She saw him take it, saw it land, and she waited for the cooling of the face, the withdrawal, the small punishment that a man of his rank could administer with a single lifted brow. It did not come. Instead, something eased in him, as though she had said the right thing rather than the wrong one. "That," he said, "is exactly the question, and I am not going to answer it yet, because you would not believe me, and you would be right not to." He inclined his head. "I will leave you to withering. Only, Miss Aldous." He paused at the door. "If anyone in this house gives you trouble, you will come to me. Not to my mother, to me. Will you remember that?" She did not promise. She had learned not to promise things to powerful people. But she inclined her head, and he seemed to take it for an answer. And he went out, and Frances stood holding her father's book and feeling, absurdly, as though she had just survived something. She looked down at the open brass case on the sill, at the small bright tools in their velvet, and she had the strangest sensation. Gone before she could hold it. That he had been looking not at her at all, but at the case. The way a man looks at a face he knows. The trouble in the house was Drusilla Carow, and it did not wait long. She was undeniably beautiful. Frances was honest enough with herself to grant it freely, with hair the colour of dark honey, and a complexion like the inside of a shell, and a way of holding her head that made every other woman in a room feel she had forgotten something. She was 23, and the daughter of Viscount Carow, and she had come to Ellesmere in the spring as a guest and stayed, with her father's connivance and the dowager's blessing, on the clear understanding that she would leave it in the new year as its duchess. She had not been consulted about whether the Duke understood this. She had not thought it necessary. She caught Frances on the stairs the second afternoon, coming up with Lady Wexcombe's shawl over her arm. "You're the companion," Drusilla said. It was not a question. She came down 2 steps so that she stood above Frances, looking down. "How clever of you. I have known girls like you before. You understand, the ones who attach themselves to old women and wait. One does grow tired of being a servant, I suppose, and a man who is bored and grieving is such an easy mark." She smiled. It was a very lovely smile. "But you should know that he is spoken for. Whatever he said at dinner was to wound his mother. They are at war, those two. It is the dullest thing in the world. And you were merely the stick he beat her with. I'd hate for you to mistake it. A woman in your position cannot afford to mistake it." Frances stood very still on the stair, with the shawl over her arm. She had been spoken to like this before, in other houses, by other beautiful women with secure futures. And she had learned that the worst thing she could do was answer in kind, because a companion who quarrels is a companion dismissed without a character. "Thank you," she said evenly. "I am not in the least danger of mistaking it. If you'll excuse me, Lady Wexcombe feels the cold." She went up past her. She felt Drusilla's eyes on her back the whole way, and she kept her own spine straight, and she did not let the shawl slip. And it was only when she had reached Lady Wexcombe's door and shut it behind her that she found her hands were shaking. The thing was, Drusilla was almost certainly right. You were merely the stick he beat her with. It fit everything Frances knew of the world. It fit far better than the alternative, which was that a duke had crossed a room for her because he wished to, and that thought was so dangerous. So much the precise shape of every disappointment she had ever set herself up for, that she put it away from her with both hands. "You look as though you've met Miss Carow," said Lady Wexcombe from her chair by the fire, not opening her eyes, on the stairs. "And did she warn you off?" "She did." "Good." Lady Wexcombe opened one eye. "She is frightened of you. Remember that. Beautiful young women who are sure of themselves do not trouble to warn off the companion. Now, bring me my shawl and tell me everything she said, and leave nothing out. for it is the only entertainment I'm likely to get before the soup. That night, Francis went looking for a tisane. Lady Wexcombe's headaches came on with the change of weather, and the rain had come down all afternoon, drumming on the stable yard cobbles below Francis's cold window, and by 10 o'clock the old woman was grey and pinched with it. The housekeeper told Francis where the still room was, a stone-floored room off the kitchen passage where the herbs were dried and the family's simples were made up, and given her leave to use it, with the resignation of a woman who had concluded that the companion at least knew what she was about. Francis had her sleeves pushed up and the feverfew steeping, and the brass case open on the scrubbed table. She had gone up for it. She always made up a draught with her father's measures. When the Duke came in out of the wet, he was in his shirt sleeves, the fine linen dark across the shoulders with rain, his hair pushed back, wet from his forehead, and he checked on the threshold when he saw her, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. "I heard someone in the still room," he said. "I thought one of the maids. There's a chimney down in the east field, and half the home farm is out in this." He looked at the steam rising off the cup, at her bared forearms, at the brass case. "You are not a maid." "Lady Wexcombe has the headache." Francis did not stop what she was doing. Her hands went on of their own accord, the way they always did, measuring, stirring. "I'm making her a draught. I had the housekeeper's leave." "What is it?" "Feverfew, chiefly. A little willow bark. It eases the kind of headache that comes with weather." She glanced at him. He had come closer, drawn by the case the way he was always drawn by the case, and she found she did not mind it as much as she should. "My father swore by it. He said half of physic was knowing which of his patients merely wanted to be listened to, and the other half could be mended with a hot draught and a dark room, and that for the small remainder there was God and good luck, and not much else." The Duke laughed. It was a short sound, surprised out of him, and it changed his whole face. Took 10 years and 2 griefs off it, just for a moment. "I think," he said, "I should have liked your father." "Most people did." Francis poured the draught off into a clean cup, and the small, competent motion steadied her. "He was poor at being paid, which is why I have a brass case and no dowry. He could not bring himself to dun a family that had a child down with fever. He died owing the apothecary £11, and the wine merchant rather more, and I have spent 2 years paying it off a quarter at a time out of my wages, and it is very nearly done." She heard herself say it, and could not think why she had. She never told anyone that. "I don't know why I told you that." "Because I asked," he said simply. "And because you are too tired to lie about it tonight, and because I think you have been carrying it alone for a long while." He was quiet a moment. The rain drummed. £11 and the wine merchant, and you have nearly cleared it on a companion's wages." He shook his head slowly. "Miss Aldous, your father was a fortunate man in one respect at least, whatever he owed the apothecary." "And what is that?" "He had you to set his accounts to rights." He straightened. "Go up to Lady Wexcombe. I'll have your fire seen to. Your room is at the cold end. The east wing chimneys never drew properly, and I've been meaning these 2 years to have them swept. It is a disgrace that you should freeze in my house. Go on. The draught will get cold." She gathered the cup and the case. At the door she stopped, because it seemed wrong to leave without it, and she said, "Thank you for the fire." "It is the very least I owe you," he said. And there was that thing in his voice again, the held-down thing. And she went up the cold stairs with the warm cup in her hands and thought about it the whole way, and did not understand it at all. When she got to her room an hour later, there was a fire in the grate, built up high and banked to last the night, and the chill was gone out of the air for the first time since she had come. She stood in front of it a long while. Then she put the brass case on the washstand where she could see it, and she went to bed warm, and she was angry at herself for how much it mattered. The next days settled into a strange rhythm, The house was full. There were 20 guests, and the shooting every fine morning, and cards and music every evening. And in the midst of all of it, the Duke of Ellesmere conducted a quiet, stubborn, entirely public campaign of treating Frances Aldous as though she were a person. He did not flirt. That was the thing that undid her composure more than flirting ever could have. He did not corner her, or press her hand, or say the low, warm things that a companion learned to deflect. He asked her opinion of books, and then listened to the answer. He saw to it that she was no longer seated below the salt. She sat now among the upper guests, to the Dowager's silent fury, and Drusilla Carrow's cold smiles. And when the rector droned, and the conversation flagged, he would catch Frances's eye down the table with the smallest lift of one brow, an invitation to a private joke, and she would have to look down at her plate to keep from laughing. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself it every night. And in a daze she found herself drawn into the work of the house, because that was who she was. She could not sit idle among idle people. When one of the undergardeners cut his hand badly on a billhook, it was Frances who was sent for, and she who cleaned and bound it, and showed the boy how to keep it dry, and word of it went round the servants' hall. When the Duke's own steward came to him grey-faced, with a quarter's accounts that would not reconcile, it was Frances, who had spent 2 years keeping a dead man's books out of debtor's court, who found the error in an afternoon, sitting at a corner of the library table while the Duke worked at the other end, the two of them passing pages back and forth in a companionable silence that neither of them remarked on, and both of them noticed. "You missed your calling," he said, when she laid the corrected page in front of him. "You should have been a man of business. You'd have ruined half the city." "I should have been a great many things," Frances said, "if I had been allowed to be any of them. As it is, I am a companion who is good at sums, which is a thing no one has the least use for." But she said it without bitterness, because the afternoon had been a good one, and she was learning, against every resolution she had made, that the hours she spent in the same room as Gabriel Severn were the best hours she had had in 2 years, and that this was a catastrophe she did not know how to stop. There was a night in that first week that she did not speak of either, though for a different reason. One of the younger housemaids, a girl named Susan, with chapped hands and a country wariness, took a fever. Nothing rare, nothing frightening to anyone but the girl herself, who lay in the cold servants' attic, shaking, and certain she was at her end, because no one had ever told her that a fever broke. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pell, came to Frances in the passage with her candle guttering and her cap askew, because there was no one else to come to. The village apothecary was 8 miles off over bad roads, and the Duke's own physician attended only the family. "You set the gardener's hand," Mrs. Pell said, half a question and half an apology. "I don't like the look of her, miss. I don't like it at all." Frances went up. The attic was raftered and freezing, the one window stuffed with rag against the draught, and the girl on the cot had worked herself into the particular terror of a person alone in the dark, with a body that has stopped obeying her. Frances sat down on the edge of the cot, and she put the back of her hand to the girl's cheek, and then to her throat, and she counted. And she did not let her own face change at all. "Now then," she said, "you are going to be very dull and very well by Thursday, and you are going to be cross that you frightened everyone for nothing. Fevers do this. They climb, and they sit at the top and roar, and then they come down, and yours is nearly at the top, which is the worst of it and the best of it, because it means the coming down is close." She wrung a cloth in the basin and laid it folded across the girl's brow. "Breathe out slow. There. Again." "Am I done for, miss?" the girl whispered. Her cracked lips caught on the words, and the cold tallow stink of the guttering stub filled the small space between them. "You are not," Frances said, "and I will tell you how I know. A person at her very end hasn't the strength to ask. You asked me twice, and the second time you were annoyed I hadn't answered the first. That is a healthy girl in a bad night, and nothing more." She wrung the cloth again. The basin water was already going tepid, and she heard the slow drip of it back off her fingers in the dark. and she kept her voice level, and she talked. About nothing. About the smell of warm bread off the Bath ovens at 6 in the morning. About a fat ginger cat her father had once owned, that hated everyone but the gout patients, and slept on their bad feet like a purring poultice. She talked until the shaking eased, and the roaring fever turned at its summit, the way she had promised it would, and the girl slid down into a true sleep, with her chapped hand closed tight around Francis's 2 fingers, and the first thin grey light beginning to creep along the cold attic floorboards. She stayed until dawn. When she came down at last, stiff and grey with want of sleep, she found the Duke in the passage at the foot of the servants' stair, in his shirt sleeves with a branch of candles in his hand, as though he had been some while there and had not liked to go up. "Mrs. Pell told me," he said. "I came to see if you wanted the carriage sent for Dr. Forel after all."
She's sleeping. The fever turned an hour ago.
Francis pushed a loose strand of hair from her face with the back of a hand that was not quite steady.
She'll want broth when she wakes, and to be kept warm, and to be told she made a great deal of fuss. That last part will do her more good than the broth.
He looked at her for a moment in the candlelight, at the shadowed eyes, the crushed grey gown she had sat up all night in, the competence that had not asked anyone's leave. "You sat with a housemaid till morning," he said slowly, as though she were a duchess.
"She was frightened,"
Francis said, "and frightened is the same in everyone. It does not check your rank first." She was too tired to mind what she said.
"My father used to tell me that a fever cannot read a name over a door. I've never found one that could."
Something moved across his face that she was too weary to read, and would spend the next several days wishing she had read better. He stood aside to let her pass, and as she went by, he said, very low, not quite to her, "No, I don't suppose it can." It was on the 4th such day that she saw the Dowager Duchess alone. She had gone to the morning room to fetch Lady Wexcombe's spectacles, which the old woman left in every room she passed through, and she had pushed the door without knocking, because she had thought the room empty. It was not. The Dowager Duchess of Ellesmere sat in the window seat, with her back half to the door, and she had not heard it open, and in her hands she held a small framed miniature, a young man, fair, laughing, painted in the blue of a cavalry coat, and her thumb was moving across the painted face, slowly, back and forth, the way a person touches a thing they have touched so many times, they have forgotten they are touching it. Her straight back was bowed. She was perfectly silent. Francis stood in the doorway. The Dowager did not turn. After a moment, Francis stepped back and drew the door to without a sound, and went away down the passage with the spectacles forgotten in the room behind her, and she did not tell anyone what she had seen, then or ever. Not because she was kind to the Dowager, who had given her no reason for kindness, but because there are some things a person should not be made to know was witnessed, and a woman alone with the face of her dead is one of them. She understood, after that, a little of why the Dowager Duchess was the way she was. It did not make her gentler, it only made her sad. The Dowager understood war, and she opened her next front at the card table. It was a wet evening, and they were at Silverloo in the saloon, the Dowager and Drusilla and Lady Brearley, and 2 of the shooting gentlemen, and Francis was where she usually was, a little apart, with Lady Wexcombe, ready to fetch and carry. The Dowager played a card and said, to the table at large, but not quite, "It is a pity about the Wexcombe woman's companion. Such a capable creature. One does wonder where a physician's daughter learns to manage a gentleman's accounts, and to bind up the gardener's hand, and dose the household. Quite the little surgeon. In my day, a young woman who knew so much of men's bodies was not generally a physician's daughter." She let it hang. "But I am old-fashioned." Lady Brearley tittered. One of the gentlemen looked at his cards very hard. Drusilla smiled into the candlelight. Francis felt the heat climb her throat. The thing about that particular cruelty was that there was no answer to it. To defend herself was to dignify it, To be silent was to seem to confess it. She had been here before. She knew how it ended, with a girl ruined by an implication she could not touch, swept out of a house in the morning with no character, because a dowager duchess does not need proof. She set down Lady Wexcombe's fan very carefully so that her hands would not shake, and she was opening her mouth to say something. She never afterwards knew what, when Lady Wexcombe got there first. "In your day, Augusta," said Lady Wexcombe, in her clear, carrying old voice, not looking up from her own cards, "young women knew nothing of anything useful whatsoever, which is precisely why your generation buried so many of its children. Francis Aldous set my hip when I came down the assembly room steps at Bath 2 winters ago, and the surgeon was 3 streets off at his dinner, and I have walked on it since, which I should not be doing had I waited for him to finish his mutton. You will forgive me if I prefer a capable creature to a decorative one." She played her card. "Lou, I believe. The trick is mine." There was a silence at the table that was worth, Francis thought afterward, a year of her wages. The dowager's face did not change, but a muscle moved at the corner of her jaw. "How fortunate for you," she said, "to have found her." "Yes," said Lady Wexcombe placidly. "It was." And she scooped the counters toward her, and the game went on, and Drusilla Caro's lovely smile had gone a little fixed. And Francis sat with her heart pounding, and her gratitude so large she could not have spoken it if she had tried. Later, on the stairs, she said, "My lady, you should not have. She will make you pay for it. She can make this fortnight very unpleasant for you." "Child," said Lady Wexcombe, climbing slowly, leaning on Francis's arm. "I am 71 years old. I have outlived everyone I was ever afraid of. And Augusta Severn has been giving herself airs since she was a viscount's plain daughter glad of a duke who would have her. There is very little she can do to me that the weather has not already done worse." She patted Francis's hand. "Besides, I find I have grown fond of you. It is a great inconvenience at my age, but there it is." It could not last, and Francis knew it could not, and the knowing of it sat under everything like a stone under still water. A house party ends. Lady Wexcombe would go home to Bath. Francis would go with her, back to the small, careful life of fetching and reading and being grateful. And the Duke of Ellesmere would marry Drusilla Caro, or some other honey-haired girl of birth and fortune, because that was what dukes did, and the 4 good days in the library would become a thing she took out and looked at on cold nights for the rest of her life. She had decided to be sensible about it. And then, on the 2nd Sunday, the shooting party went out to the high coverts, and a gentleman's horse put its foot in a rabbit hole and came down, and the whole careful, sensible structure Francis had built came down with it. She was in the lower garden when they brought him in. Mr. Penrose, one of the shooting gentlemen, young and laughing that morning, and grey now, carried on a hurdle by 4 white-faced grooms, his right arm bent in a way an arm should not bend, the bone risen against the skin. "The surgeon," someone was shouting. "The surgeon was at Marlow. It would be 2 hours. 3. Francis did not remember crossing the garden. She was simply there, on her knees in the gravel beside the hurdle, and her hands were on the arm, fast and certain, not wasting a movement, and her voice came out of her low and clear and steady, the way it always did when there was a body under her hands that needed mending. "Set him down. Gently. Gently. You." She caught a footman by the eye. "My case. Brass, on the washstand, 3rd room past the green baize in the east wing. Run!" She looked at the white-faced grooms. "2 of you hold his shoulders. You, your belt, give it me. Mr. Penrose." She put her face close to his. His eyes were rolling. "Mr. Penrose, look at me. You have broken your arm. I am going to set it before the swelling locks it, and it is going to hurt very much. And then it is going to be a great deal better. Do you understand me? Hold your breath when I tell you." and the Duke of Ellesmere, who had ridden in at the head of the party and flung himself off his horse and come at a run. The Duke stopped, 3 feet away, and went absolutely still. Because he had heard those words before. He had heard that exact, low, clear, steady voice say those exact words on a flooded road in Berkshire in the spring, with the rain coming down and his own bone risen white against the night. It is going to hurt very much. Hold your breath when I tell you. He stood frozen in the gravel and watched her set Penrose's arm, the brass case open on the grass, the splint bound between 2 riding crops and a torn coat, the boys screaming dropping all at once from unbearable to merely terrible as the bone went home. And he understood, finally and completely and with a feeling like the ground tilting, that he had not built her up in his memory at all, that she was exactly what he remembered, that the woman his mother had called no one down the length of his table had once knelt in the dark and dragged a stranger out of a flood and given him back the use of his arm, and walked away at dawn rather than be thanked. "There," Francis was saying, low and certain, tying off the splint. "There, the worst is past. Carry him in, flat, mind the arm, and lay him in the green room, and send to Marlowe for the surgeon to dress it properly. But the setting will hold. It's a clean break. He'll keep the arm." She sat back on her heels, and she was grey and shaking now that it was done, the way she always was. And she looked up, and found the Duke of Ellesmere staring at her, as though she were a ghost risen up out of the gravel. "Your Grace," she said. "He'll do. I promise you, he'll—" "I know he will," Gabriel said. His voice was not quite steady. "I know exactly how well he will do, Miss Aldous. I have rather particular reason to know." She did not understand him. She was too spent to try. The grooms lifted the hurdle, and the household closed around them, and the moment passed. But the Duke stood in the gravel a moment longer, looking at the open brass case in the grass, and he pressed his right hand slowly closed, feeling the deep, familiar ache come up in the joint, and he thought, 6 months. 6 months I looked for you, and you were 3 places down my own table, telling the rector about the seed and not the leaf. The Dowager Duchess found her son that night in the library and shut the door. "I have heard about this afternoon," she said. "The whole house has heard. The companion played surgeon in the gravel, and you stood and watched her do it as though she had hung the moon." She came toward him, and for once her voice was not cold. It was something nearer to fear. "Gabriel, I am going to ask you a question, and I want a true answer. This debt you spoke of, is it her? Is she the one who— that business in the spring, the curricle, the arm you would never speak of? Is the companion the woman who—" "Yes," Gabriel said. The Dowager sat down. She had not meant to. Her knees simply put her in the chair. "I see," she said. "I see." She pressed her fingers to her mouth a moment. "Then pay her. Pay her handsomely. Settle a sum on her, £100, 200, whatever salves your conscience, and let her go back to Bath with the Wexcombe woman and have done. A debt is a thing you discharge, Gabriel. It is not a thing you marry. And if I do not wish to discharge it? Then you are a fool," his mother said, and now the cold was back, the flint in the grey eyes. Because cold was the only armour she had ever been given, and she put it on the way other women put on shawls. "Listen to me. I know what you think of me. You think me hard and proud and unkind to a girl who has done you a service. Perhaps I am all 3. But I have buried a husband and a son in this house, Gabriel." Her voice caught once on the word son and went on. "And I have learned what it costs to love past your station and your sense." She turned the ring on her finger, round and round. "Your grandfather married for love. A merchant's beautiful daughter, all charm and no settlement, and the family was 30 years climbing out of the hole her empty dowry put us in, and he died still apologizing for it. I came into this house as a bride, with the debt of it still on the books, and I have spent my whole life mending what one love match cost. I will not watch you open the same wound twice. Rank is not vanity. Rank is the wall that keeps the cold out. Take it down for a physician's penniless daughter, and you will spend the rest of your life watching the cold come in. I am trying. And here the cold cracked, just once, all the way through. I am trying to keep you. Gabriel looked at his mother for a long moment, and some of the hardness went out of his own face, because he had heard, under the flint, the thing she had not quite managed to hide. I know you are, he said gently, but you are trying to keep me by walling me up alive, Mother. And I have been walled up for 2 years, and I am tired of it, and I would rather risk the cold. He paused. She does not know yet that it was her, that I am the man from the road. I have not told her because I do not want her to come to me out of obligation, the way you would have me go to Drusilla Carow out of obligation. When I tell her, I want it to be a free thing, given and taken freely, or not at all. He met her eyes. I had hoped before that to have my mother's blessing. I find I do not require it, but I should still very much like to have it. The dowager rose. At the door she stopped, and she did not turn, and she said, in a voice scraped down to almost nothing, I will not bless it, but I will not stop it either. That is the most I can do. Do not ask me for more than I have, Gabriel. I gave the most of what I had to the 2 of them I put in the ground. She went out. It was not a blessing, but it was the first time in 2 years she had given him anything at all, and they both knew it. The morning came up clear and cold and gold, the first real frost of the autumn, and Frances woke early and could not bear the house, and so she took her shawl and went out into the gardens while the rest of them slept. The Duke was already there. He was standing at the end of the long walk, where the lilac hedge ran bare and grey along the old wall, his breath smoking in the cold, and he turned when he heard her step on the frosted gravel, and he did not look surprised, and she understood that he had been waiting, that he had perhaps been waiting every morning, and her heart did a foolish thing in her chest that she could not stop. Miss Aldous. He came toward her. You could not sleep either. I am not used to sleeping in warm rooms, she said. You ruined my room. I had grown attached to the cold. And he laughed, that short, surprised laugh, and the gold light was on his face. And for a moment, Frances forgot every sensible thing she had decided. They walked the long walk together. He told her about the garden, what the lilac hedge looked like in May, the whole grey length of it gone purple and heavy, and the scent of it so thick you could not think. And she listened, and the picture of it bloomed in her mind, and without meaning to, she said, I should like to see that, and then heard the words hanging in the cold air between them. When the lilacs come out. A future she had no right to imagine, and she flushed and looked away. You will, the Duke said. He said it quietly and certainly, as though it were already arranged, as though her seeing the lilacs at Ellesmere in May were the most natural and settled thing in the world. I promise you, you will. She should have stopped him. She knew she should have stopped him. Instead, she stood in the frost, with the bare lilac hedge before them, and let herself, for one morning, simply be happy, the way she had not let herself be happy in 2 years. And he stood beside her, not touching her, his bare hand resting on the top of the old wall close to hers, close enough that she could feel the warmth come off it in the cold air. And neither of them moved their hands, and neither of them moved away, and the whole grey garden held its breath around them, the way the dinner table had held its breath the first night. And it was, Frances thought, the happiest she had ever been. or ever expected to be.
"Francis," he said. Her name, her Christian name, for the first time, and it landed like a touch. "There is a thing I have to tell you. I should have told you days ago. I have been a coward about it because I was afraid that once you knew it, you would." A bell rang up at the house, then another, then voices, raised, and a door banging, and a footman running down the long walk toward them, calling the Duke's name. The moment broke. Whatever he had been about to say went back down inside him, and the gold morning was over. And they went up to the house together, not touching. And Francis would think for a long time afterward that if the bell had rung 1 minute later, everything might have been different. It was Drusilla Caro who broke it, and she did it cleanly, with a single conversation, the way a skilled hand fells a tree with one cut placed exactly right. She came to Francis's cold room that afternoon. She had never been above stairs in her life, and the climb had put a flush of temper in her shell-pink cheeks. And she did not sit, and she did not pretend to be kind. "You think he means it," she said. "I can see it in your face. You actually think the Duke of Ellesmere is going to throw over his name, and his mother, and a viscount's daughter for a companion who sets bones in the gravel." She laughed, and it was not lovely now. It was contempt, naked. "You poor, stupid creature. Do you know what he told his mother? I had it from her own woman, who had it through the library door. He said, 'He owes you a debt.' Those were his words. A debt. From the spring, some business on a road, a carriage, a broken arm. You are the woman who mended his arm in some inn and crept away." She let that land before she went on, watching it land. "And now his conscience cannot rest until he has paid you. And a man like that pays in the only coin that will quiet him. He is kind to you. He raises you up the table. He sees to your fire. And he tells himself it is something finer than guilt, because guilt is an ugly word." She stepped close. "He is not in love with you, Miss Aldous. He is in debt to you. And there is no humiliation in the world quite like being a debt that a man has decided to be noble about. When the bill is paid, he will marry me, and you will go back to Bath, and he will send you £200 at Christmas, and feel he has behaved beautifully. I thought you ought to hear it from someone who is not pretending." She went out. She left the door open behind her, which was its own small cruelty, the cold air of the passage coming in to take back the room. Francis sat down on the edge of the narrow bed. The thing about the cruelty was that it was true. Not Drusilla's spite. That she could have stood. The fact under the spite. The arm. The brass case he was always looking at. I owe her a debt. It is mine, and it is not small, and I mean to pay it. The held-down thing in his voice that she had never been able to read. She could read it now. It was guilt. It had always been guilt. The man on the Reading Road in the spring, the fevered stranger whose bones she had set in the firelight, the one who had asked her name twice, and whom she had told only to drink. That had been Gabriel Severn, Duke of Ellesmere, and she had not known him, and he had known her from the first night, from her voice down the table, and everything since. The apology, the fire, the 4 good days in the library, the lilacs, Francis. Every kindness had been a coin laid on a debt. She had been so careful. She had decided to be sensible, and she had let herself be happy in the frost this very morning. Had let herself say, "I should like to see that." Had let a man rest his hand a half-inch from hers on a cold wall, and let herself believe it meant the thing she wanted it to mean. He had crossed his own dining room for her, not because she was anything, but because she had once been useful to him in the dark, and a decent man does not forget a debt, and she had mistaken the paying of it for love. She got up. She moved very steadily, because steadiness was the only thing she had ever owned. She took down her box from the top of the press, and she began to fold the grey gowns into it. She would not stay to be paid. She had never in her life let a debt be paid to her face. She had walked out of the inn at dawn rather than be thanked. She had paid for her own room. She had carried her father's brass case and her own pride out of 100 houses where she was wanted only for what her hands could do. And she would not stay in this one to be a noble man's settled conscience. She would go before dawn. She would tell Lady Wexcombe she was unwell. She would catch the carrier's cart at the crossroads and be in Marlow by the time the house woke, and the Duke of Ellesmere could send his £200 at Christmas to an address she would take care he never had. He had stood up from the table to pay a debt. The arm he had offered her down the length of that room was the arm she had mended. It was an entry in a ledger, and she was the sum of it. And she had let herself forget for 4 days that she had spent her whole life learning exactly what she was worth to people like him. She folded the last gown. She set her father's brass case on top of it, the small bright tools in their velvet beds, and she closed the box and corded it. Then she sat down by the window to wait out the night, dry-eyed, looking at the stable yard where the carrier's cart would come. And she did not let herself weep, because weeping was a thing you did when you had been surprised. And she had not been surprised. She had only, for 4 days, forgotten to remember. She went down before first light, in the dark, in her travelling gown, the corded box too heavy on her hip, and the brass case in her free hand, feeling her way down the cold east stairs by the rail, because she dared not carry a candle and be seen. She was on the half landing when she heard it, a step above her, quick and angry, a voice she knew. The Dowager Duchess, of all people, down at this black hour, hissing her name into the dark. "Miss Aldous, stop. I know what you are about. Hester Wexcombe's woman heard you cording your box. And you will not, do you hear me? You will not creep out of my house in the dark like a thief, and have it said for the next 20 years that the Duke of Ellesmere drove a girl out into the—" She never finished it. In the dark, in her temper, in her thin shoes on the cold stone, the Dowager Duchess of Ellesmere set her foot wrong on the top step, and came down. Frances heard it before she understood it. The gasp, the terrible scrabble of a hand failing to catch the rail, the soft, heavy wrongness of a body falling on stone. And then she had dropped the box and the case, and she was up the stairs in the dark with her hands already out, because that was who she was. That was the only thing she had never once in her life had to decide. The Dowager was crumpled on the half landing, white, her breath coming in shallow, tearing gasps, her right wrist cradled against her and bent. Frances's hands found it in the grey dark. Bent the wrong way, the small bones gone where they should not be. "Be still," Frances said. Low, clear, steady. The voice did its old work. The Dowager's panicked gasping eased a fraction at the sound of it. "You've broken your wrist and turned your ankle and knocked the breath from you, and none of it will kill you, and I'm going to see to all 3. Be still and let me. Can you feel your fingers? Move them for me. Good. Good. Nothing worse than the wrist, then." Her hands were already working, certain in the dark, finding the break, learning it. "This will hurt, Your Grace. I am sorry. When I tell you, hold your breath." "You—" The Dowager's voice was a thread. In the grey light coming up now at the stair window, her flint eyes found Frances's face. And they were not flint now. They were an old, frightened woman's eyes, stripped of every wall. "You were leaving. I drove you to it, and you turned back to— Why? Why would you—" "Because your wrist is broken," Frances said, as though it were the simplest thing in the world, which, to her, it was. "And I am the one who is here. Now hold your breath." She set it. The Dowager cried out, once, and then it was done, and the bone was home, and Frances was already tearing a length from her own petticoat to bind it, calling up the stairs now in her carrying voice for lights, for a man to carry her Grace, for someone to wake the house. And the house woke. Footmen with candles, the housekeeper, a maid weeping, and through all of it Frances knelt on the cold half-landing, with the Dowager Duchess's broken wrist in her 2 hands, and held it steady, and would not let it go. And it was so that the Duke of Ellesmere found them, coming 3 steps at a time down the dark stair in his shirt sleeves, his mother white on the stone, and the woman he loved kneeling over her in a travelling gown, with a corded box and a brass case abandoned at the bottom of the flight. They carried the Dowager to her room, and Francis set the wrist properly by candlelight, and splintered it, and dosed her for the pain. And only when the old woman was asleep at last, grey dawn full in the windows, did Francis come out into the passage and find the Duke waiting. He had her corded box. He had carried it up himself, and the brass case, and he set them down between them, and he looked at the travelling gown and the box, and her white, exhausted face, and he said very quietly, "You were going." "I was going." "In the dark, before I woke, paying for your own room and walking out at dawn." His mouth twisted. It was not quite a smile. "You have done this before. To me, Francis. In the spring, on the Reading Road." And there it was, out at last, in the grey morning in the cold passage, and Francis felt the whole careful structure of her leaving go very still inside her. "So it was you," she said. "Drusilla told me. I told myself the spite in it was hers and only hers, but the fact underneath it fit too well to argue with. The arm, the case, the way you looked at it. It was you. The curricle at the ford, the fever. You're the man I—" She stopped. "You knew. From the first night at the table. You knew who I was, and I did not know you." "I knew you the moment you spoke to the rector," he said. "The seed, not the leaf. I have been listening for that voice for 6 months. I wrote to the inn. I wrote to the coaching company. I described your hands to half of Berkshire. And then my mother called you no one down the length of my table, and I—" He spread his hands. I stood up. I could not do anything else. "To pay a debt." Her voice came out flat and steady, and she was proud of how steady it was. "I understand it. You needn't be ashamed of it. You owed me your arm, and you are a decent man, and a decent man cannot rest while a debt stands. And so you were kind to me, and you raised me up the table, and you saw to my fire, and this morning in the garden you nearly told me, and the debt would have been discharged, and your conscience clear. I do understand. I would rather not be paid to my face. I never have been able to bear it. So I was going to go before you could." She bent for the box. "Send the £200 to Francis." He had not moved, but something in his voice stopped her hand on the cord. "Look at me. Is that what you think this is?" "It is what you told your mother. I owe her a debt." "I told my mother that because it was the only word she would hear," he said. "Because she does not believe in any reason a man crosses a room except duty, and debt was a thing she could understand. And I did not have the words yet for the true thing, and so I gave her the false one that was nearest to it." He came toward her, and he stopped close, and he did not take her hands. He only stood where she would have to look up at him. "Listen to me, because I am only going to say it the once, and then it is yours to do with as you like. I did not look for you for 6 months to pay you. A man does not write to half of Berkshire to discharge a debt. He sends a bank draft and forgets your face. I looked for you because for one night on a flooded road, a stranger with quick hands and a steady voice pulled me out of the cold, and would not be frightened, and would not be thanked, and would not stay. And I have not been able to stop thinking about her since." His jaw worked. "I did not know your name. I did not know your face in daylight. I knew your hands and your voice, and the way you said, 'Hold your breath.' And I knew that I had met, once, in the worst night of my life, the bravest and most maddening woman in England, and that she had walked away from me at dawn. and that I would have given the whole of Ellesmere to find her again. His voice dropped, and then I found her below the salt in my own dining room, and my mother called her no one, and I have spent 2 weeks falling in love with her over Withering's foxglove and a column of figures and a frost-cold garden. And this morning I came out to the lilac walk to tell her so, and a bell rang, and I lost my nerve. So I am telling her now. It was never the debt, Francis. The debt would have been the easiest thing in the world. You are the thing I cannot pay off and cannot do without. Francis stood with her hand on the cord of the box, and the grey dawn came up gold at the passage window, and she found that the steadiness she had owned her whole life had finally, completely deserted her. "You stood up from the table," she said. Her voice was not steady at all now. "In front of all of them. For me." "I would do it again tonight," he said. "I would do it every night for the rest of my life. Stay, Francis. Not because I owe you, because the lilacs come out in May, and I want you here to see them. And I have been walled up cold for 2 years, and you are the first warm thing that has come into this house since I buried my brother. And I love you, and I have for 6 months, and I knew it before I knew your name." He looked at her, and there was nothing held down in his voice now, nothing hidden, the whole of it open and offered, like the arm he had held out the length of the table. "I'm asking you to be my wife, not my conscience. My wife." Francis let go of the cord. "I should warn you," she said, and a laugh came up through the tears that had finally arrived, helpless and unsteady and entirely beyond her control, "that I am very poor at being paid, and I will run your accounts whether you wish it or not, and I will not stop setting bones in the gravel, and your mother does not like me in the least." "My mother," said Gabriel, "is upstairs with her wrist in your splint, alive because you turned back on the stair when you might have walked out into the dark. And I rather think that is the beginning of her liking you, whether she wishes it or not. Marry me, Francis Aldous. Say it plainly. I have waited 6 months for you to stop walking away from me at dawn." "Then I will stop," Francis said. "Yes. Plainly. Yes." He took her hands then, both of them, the quick, certain hands that had set his bone in the firelight, and he raised them to his mouth, and the grey passage was full of gold, and somewhere below a footman was lighting the fires, and the great cold house of Ellesmere was beginning, for the first time in 2 years, to wake up warm. The Dowager Duchess sent for Francis 3 days later, when she could sit up against her pillows with her splinted wrist on a cushion, and Francis came, because she had been raised to come when she was sent for, and old habits did not break in a week. For a while the Dowager said nothing. She looked at the splint on her wrist, Francis's neat work, the binding exact, the small, bright competence of it. And then she looked at Francis, standing by the door with her hands folded, waiting to be told what she was. "My son tells me you are to marry him," the Dowager said. "He has asked me. I have said yes." Francis kept her voice even. "I know it is not what you wished. I will not pretend it is. But I will not pretend I am sorry either. And I think you have had enough of people pretending things at you, Your Grace. So I will not add to it." Something moved in the Dowager's face, surprise, and under it, grudgingly, something almost like respect. She reached, awkwardly with her good hand, to the table by the bed, and took up a folded paper, sealed, and held it out. "Take it," she said. When Francis came and took it, "It is in my own hand. I wrote it left-handed, which is why it is a disgrace to look at, and it cost me more than the writing of it to set down. Read it." Francis broke the seal and unfolded it. The hand was cramped and wavering, the letters of a proud woman who had taught herself in 3 days to write with the wrong hand, rather than dictate a private thing to a servant. She read the first line aloud, because she could not quite believe it, and her voice caught. "To whom it concerns. The late Dr. Edmund Aldous of Reading was a physician of rare skill and rarer honesty, to whom the family of Ellesmere stands in a debt it can never fully repay, and whose daughter, Frances, does him and us honour. "You will find," said the dowager, looking at the wall and not at Frances, "that I have written to the apothecary at Reading, and to the wine merchant, and to every soul your father died owing, and that the accounts are settled in full, and that his name is clear in that town as it should always have been. He mended people who could not pay him. A man like that should not lie in the ground a debtor. It was—" her voice was very low. "It was not right that he did. It has been put right." She paused. The good hand smoothed the coverlet once, the gesture of a woman who needed something for her fingers to do. "I find I do not like owing things any better than you do, Miss Aldous. We are alike in that, you and I, which is a thing I did not expect, and do not entirely welcome." Her mouth made the smallest movement, the ghost of her son's dry humour, run down to her through the same hard line. "My son could have done a great deal worse. He has, in fact, an arrangement with Viscount Carrow that I encouraged for the better part of a year, and I have this morning written to break it, and the Viscount will be very angry, and his daughter angrier, and the connection and the fortune are both lost to us." She looked at her splintered wrist, at the neat, exact binding. "And I find I do not greatly care. I have buried the two people I loved most in the world for the sake of keeping the cold out, and a girl I called no one knelt down on a cold stair and would not let me break worse than my wrist. So—" She drew a breath. It cost her, visibly, the way the first step on a turned ankle costs. "I was wrong. There. I have said it, and you may tell my son I said it, for he will not believe you, and it will do him good to hear it twice. You are not no one, Frances Aldous. You never were. I called you that to make it true, and it would not stay true, and I am too old and too lately frightened to go on saying things that will not stay true." She turned her face away. "Now go. I am tired, and I have humbled myself enough for one morning to last me the rest of the year." Frances stood holding the letter in her father's clear name, the cramped, wrong-handed lines of it swimming, and she did a thing she had not planned, and could not have explained. She crossed to the bed, and she took up the dowager's good hand, and she held it. "Thank you," she said. The Dowager Duchess of Ellesmere did not pull her hand away. After a moment, stiffly, the fingers closed on Frances's own, and the two of them stayed like that a little while in the quiet room. The proud old woman and the physician's daughter. The wall between them not gone, it would never be quite gone, but with a door in it now, narrow and grudging and real, that had not been there before. They were married in the spring, in the small church at Ellesmere, when the lilac hedge along the old garden wall had gone purple and heavy, and the scent of it lay so thick across the long walk that, Frances found, the Duke had been entirely right. You could not think for the sweetness of it. It was a quiet wedding by the standards of dukes. Lady Wexcombe came up from Bath and wept all through it, and pretended it was the cold. The Dowager Duchess sat in the front pew very upright, her wrist long since mended, and said afterward that the bride's gown, deep lilac silk, the colour of the hedge, chosen by the bride herself against every counsel of fashion, was not at all the thing, and then was observed by Lady Wexcombe to dab once at her eye with the back of her glove, and call it the draught from the door. And in the years that came after, the great cold house of Ellesmere was not cold any longer. There were children in the long gallery, and dogs in the library, and tenants at the door who asked, when they were hurt or feverish, not for the surgeon at Marlow, but for her Grace, who would come with a slim brass case worn smooth at the corners, and quick hands that did not waste a movement, and a low, clear voice that told them to hold their breath. The brass case lived now on the mantel in the morning room, open, the small bright tools in their velvet beds, the first thing she saw of a morning, the way her father had kept it. And no one in that house ever again called the woman who carried it no one. Because the Dowager Duchess herself, in her last years, had taken to calling her my daughter. And what the Dowager called a thing at Ellesmere tended to stay called. On the morning of their first wedding day, Gabriel found Francis at the end of the long walk where the lilac hedge ran heavy and purple in the May sun, exactly where they had stood in the frost 2 autumns before, with their bare hands a half-inch apart on the cold wall. The scent of the lilacs was everywhere. He came up beside her and rested his right hand on the top of the old wall, the arm she had sat on a flooded road 2 springs ago, the arm he had offered her the length of his dinner table. And this time, she did not leave a half-inch of cold air between them. She laid her hand over his. "You said I should see them," she said. "The lilacs. You promised." "I keep my promises," said the Duke of Ellesmere, "if I am given long enough." And he turned her hand over in his and kissed the palm of it, the quick, certain palm that had mended him in the dark, and the whole purple hedge breathed its sweetness over the 2 of them. And Frances Severn stood in the warm May morning in the garden of her own home, and was, at last, exactly where she had stood, and exactly who she was, and not no one at all.